Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm reporting to you nice and bright and early because it is time once again for another Chris Chan quickie reading. And this one should be quite a little bit more interesting because this is Chris's views on business. And hey, this is something that absolutely I feel like I would actually have a pretty good handle for talking about because for those who don't know, I run my own business. Yes, I am technically a sole trader, and yes, I also do have a 9 to 5 job. Well, I work 8 hours and 40 hours a week, if that makes sense. So, yeah, actually, the concept of doing things that are for good for business and actually finding ways to improve my PR, my image, trying to get ahead in the world, and finding out all the trends, the tidbits, and making new friends and knowing more about the world and about other people and what makes them tick is actually something that is almost paramount, if not absolutely essential when it comes to business. Because outside of just knowing, again, the essentials like the importance of good PR, the responsibility that involves, things like bookkeeping, being in charge of your tax returns, keeping in tabs with, your insurance, your profit margins, your break-evens, your labor costs. There's a lot of responsibility. It's tough being at the top, you know what I mean? But it is what it is, and it's something that, to be honest, I've fully sort of just like embraced and kind of wanted to do for a very long time. I mean, the competition gets stiff. The new players are getting younger and younger. In fact, I may only be 26, but I felt honestly that if I didn't do it soon, then I just never would do it at all. And finally, there is Chris. Now, this is something that pretty much is going to fall back and forth because Chris's attitudes to business are very much in sort of a little bit in line with Chris's attitudes to pretty much everything, but let's explore because there's a little bit more to it than that. This is not my fault the frame got broken transaction. The envelope was clearly marked fragile and handled with care, and it was shipped well in a bubble envelope. Either you, being trollish, or the postal carriers are to blame for the frame's arriving condition. This is an example of Chris's acute customer service skills by saying, it's not our fault, it's somebody else's fault. Which is, you know what, listen, I used to do home deliveries and stuff like that before, and guess what? Every single time I had to deliver something that had fragile on it, trust me, I carried that stuff around as though there must have been like a bomb hidden inside. So I had to, be as fragile as possible and literally just you do what you gotta do, because guess what? That's called being responsible. And you know what? Again, it does beg the question about why Chris didn't just feel the need to, go and take extra precautions for things that are fragile, especially when there's anything involving glass in deliveries. Chris launched an online business in June 2014, selling customer arts and crafts through eBay. A year later, he moved shop to Etsy under a brand titled Quickfill Shopping. He also began selling printed copies of Sonichu on Lulu. He held a steady stream of customers despite issues with production and sending orders on time. For a while, he had achieved his dream of selling his own Sonichu merchandise and was making plenty of money. However, exactly 2 years and 1 week after the start of his online business, on the 8th of June 2016, Chris's infamous laziness caught up to him once again, and he was banned from Etsy for ignoring orders over a span of months beginning when he bought a PlayStation 4. He did not take responsibility for the self-inflicted failure of his own business. Instead, he lied to save face and cast blame on Lulu.com staff for having stressed him out by labeling Sonichu as fanfiction and banning his account half a year beforehand in December 2016. Even though he had ban evaded by opening a private account and was back to offering books through Lulu services only weeks later. Analyze and interpret, ladies and gentlemen, is that I remember back in 2021 when I actually had a Redbubble store. I still have the store. I've never actually sold anything off my store, but you know what? I just decided I wanted to sell little like t-shirts and just like little coasters and like the mats. And basically anyone who's ever tried to sell anything on Redbubble will sort of know a little bit about its interface and how things work. And all of it was my own work as well. And that was absolutely a fact. I saw everything I did there was original. I made completely my own. And, well, I even do own like one piece of merchandise that I actually made, which is like a t-shirt with like a fancy R written on it with like the two logos of my brand on the side. Well, what used to be my brand at any rate. Anyway, the case I'm trying to make, ladies and gentlemen, is that, you know what? It's because, again, through Sonichu and the fact it couldn't be made commercially viable because under the circumstances of what it is, labeled as either fan fiction or parody, there's very little that Chris actually can do. And by the way, when we get into the issues of things like copyright, Chris seems to think that a loophole in the law, i.e. Chris can call Sonichu a parody, means that legally he is completely in the clear and he can call Sonichu an original work no matter what any lawyer, court, or judge will tell him. So, unfortunately for Chris, he should, again, this is the sort of thing he should have known from the very beginning, but you know what? If I could have traveled back to 98 when like even Bionic was created, it would have been a good time to tell him. And bear in mind, all this began because Chris's art teacher would not let him use Sonic for a high school project. After the Etsy ban, Chris fell back on begging and paid video requests to cover Bob's credit card bills and his expensive toy purchases. In May 20... It doesn't sound very responsible when you know Chris is blowing things on toys as opposed to, you know, things like, again, your mortgage or the fact that, again, because of other things aside, Chris very nearly lost his house completely a year later, but we'll get to that. In May 2017, he felt like returning to work on the Sonichu comic, and throughout the next several months began to rebuild his business, using Patreon, Lulu, and Redbubble, and accepting interviews for money. Now, again, I've used Redbubble. I haven't actually ever used Lulu. I do have a Patreon as well, but again, I'll advertise it, and whether or not people actually just want to check it out and stuff like that, it is what it is. It's not vital, but it is just, it's good for a little bit of a bit of extra money, I suppose. But I don't know, if you were interested whatsoever, I might leave links to my Patreon down below, but we'll wait and see about that. List of ventures by type. Storefronts. On the 1st of June 2014, Chris began cashing in on his internet infamy by offering custom artwork for sale. He later expanded his sales to include autographed photos, medallions, custom amiibos, and personal items related to Christery. This would be his most profitable and otherwise his most important commercial endeavor. Over the years, he would earn thousands of dollars by selling off Sonichu-themed memorabilia and sundries. The largest financial contributions were often made by aspiring weens to establish contact with Chris and put themselves in a friendly position. It is one of the ways to actually earn his trust by pretending that, you know, you care enough about him to help him out in his endeavors. Now, to be fair, Chris will probably never see anyone like this, but as you'll begin to see, it's Chris's views on who he trusts can be completely at random for no other reasons than, well, Chris just decides what he wants. The heart wants what the heart wants, as they say. He would not always fulfill his orders. However, and after receiving an abysmal 85% satisfaction rate through customer reviews, now in case you're wondering, does 85% on eBay sound really as low as it does? Oh yes, it really does. On average, getting less than roughly 94% is an immediate red flag, but getting 85% is like extremely curtailed, and it's, well, Chris only has himself to blame for that, because until we see him eventually do what he always does and blame eBay staff, well, we have just this to go off. Through customer reviews, his merchant account was suspended on the 16th of June 2019. Proposals to circumvent the ban through a partnership with Jacob Soknes that were fortunately never implemented. On the 2nd of September 2015, Chris expanded his online business to Etsy. He continued the same offerings from eBay as before, and added a donation list for the continuation of the Sonichu series. Days later, on the 5th of September, a YouTuber named D-Stex donated $1,000, thinking that Chris would deliver 100 pages of Sonichu. Big mistake. Instead, Chris completed 16, not 100, 16 pages before dropping the project entirely. This move remains controversial with Christorians, as while some believe that he honestly wanted Sonichu 11 to continue, others argue that this weenish move validated begging in Chris's eyes, as seen with the influx of begging videos in the Financial crisis. In addition to D-Stex, dozens of fans had also donated. Chris simply claimed that he was too stressed to continue Sonichu issue 11. Bullshit answer, ladies and gentlemen. You don't want to know why? Because even when I was going through issues of financial distress, whenever I was commissioned to do something, you know what? I got my head down and actually worked on things. You don't just, because guess what? Outside of the fact that you've tarnished your name, it could tarnish your name for many, many years, because in the eyes of the public, all they'll be seeing you as a con artist. And unfortunately for Chris, they will see him literally as nothing but a con artist. Or, better still, they'll see him as an incompetent con artist, because if $1,000 was not enough to get Chris out of a particularly ugly hole, then you wonder if Chris was ever in any doubt about his finances whatsoever. This is despite the fact that what happens during the Idea Guys saga. But we'll come to that later. However, Chris still had a passion for making custom amiibos for several months afterwards. He took it seriously enough that he was willing to drive hundreds of miles through Virginia just to buy parts of amiibos to sell on Etsy. Possibly not the greatest move in the world, he wasted hundreds of dollars buying up amiibos on eBay, thinking that the market for his custom figures would sustain itself indefinitely. Well, considering how we know successful the Wii U turned out to be, no, it wasn't. This was not the case, and Chris eventually grew apathetic and bored with earning his own money. To complicate things further, Chris purchased a PlayStation 4 in March 2016. The New Life upgrade proved too distracting, and he ignored Etsy orders, often for months. Ultimately, Etsy took notice and banned his store from doing business. And in case you're wondering whether Chris literally would have taken the advice of Arthur Spatchcock to do a Let's Play channel and actually earn revenue through actually playing video games like he suggested, Chris decided that even that was like far too much, and he even accompanied the idea with a stress sigh. Proving once again, let me just remind something to you guys, very important, is that proud and lazy people do not make good businessmen. Because, well, as we'll see through here and through things we'll see later on, the idea of trying to run a business when the only thing you care about is yourself is it's a recipe for disaster. Because for those who are wondering why it doesn't work, and the reasons why, again, this is even long before... Okay, here's the thing. When I wanted to get into business, I had to ask myself the important question of not just why I wanted to get into business, when did I want to get into business, but also how was I going to do it? How was I going to make myself successful? How was I going to make money from what I did? How was I going to continue to make money? And there are plenty of other questions I could ask about this, but the one regarding how is that, well, first of all, you have to make sure your own house is in order first. But then again, you could argue 14 Branch Lane Court is a sort of microcosm for Chris's complete inability to formulate a consistent narrative, consistently come up with a creative thought pattern, any level of business acumen, or take what is often referred to in the cabinet as collective responsibility. Yeah, bear in mind, and bear in mind, all of these could be just buzzwords to make Chris sigh for, like, minutes on end. So, the very thought that even Chris could, like... It all comes back down to the fact that it simply seemed like too much hard work, and if, again, Chris is the sort of person who will, whenever the situation calls for it, will always take the path of least resistance. All that matters to Chris is that people give him money, and that they will continue to give him money, and Chris doesn't have to say thank you in return for it. He is a human charity. I would go even one further and say that no, charities are usually on occasions actually quite appreciative for what they receive, Chris is not even that. And nobody wants to do business with people who are, again, lazy, overtly proud, and don't even know how to say thank you. I'll talk a little bit more about this in greater detail when it comes to when Chris was given a Nintendo Switch 5 years ago. But just so you guys are aware, that story was disgusting for different reasons. Not from a business point of view, from every conceivable level. And in case you're wondering if my opinions will change about this, well, no. And again, I'll try my best to explain why. Self-publishing. Chris took over a decade to try and self-publishing channels. Clyde Cash beat him to the punch by posting Chris's comics on Lulu.com. Chris simply retorted by encouraging his fans not to buy them, and to simply wait for him to release the real versions later. A bit late for that, Chris. According to emails from 2010, Chris claimed that he was working on fixing up his pages to be published on Lulu, taking an unreasonably amount of time to accomplish this amazingly simple task. I mean, literally, while I'm in the mid-process of making this video, I could literally use my second monitor right here and do it. That's literally how simple it is. In September 2015, as well as offering autograph versions through Etsy by ordering the comics from Lulu, signing them, then shipping to the buyers. In December 2015, Chris was banned from Lulu for selling fanfiction, which, yes, you know what, is in violation of the site's terms of service, and it's important as well that you keep yourselves up to tabs about what you can and can't do. I've never really run into this situation myself, but again, knowing exactly what your rights are and what the wrongs are absolutely paramount. And it could save you a lot of trouble in the future, so just bear that in mind. In true Chris fashion, he responded by threatening Lulu's executives with physical violence. I would say that that's a response that speaks for itself, but then again, this is the sort of thing that legally can land you in very hot water, because somebody who is openly threatening people will be blacklisted, not just from Lulu, because again, big websites like these, whether it's Lulu, Redbubble, Gumroad, they will communicate in some way or form, or possibly even, you know, trolls, white knights, weens, or more corporate white knights, they will go to these sorts of levels to make sure that Chris doesn't get his foot in the door anywhere. Now, personally, I wouldn't for Chris anyway, but then again, I'm not an executive from Gumroad, or from Lulu, or from itch.com, so that's entirely down to them. And if Chris doesn't violate the rules on their sites, then I suppose that's fine. I suppose. Despite the fact that he was on probation for an act of violence against a GameStop employee, well, there you go, Chris was able to continue selling comics in January 2016, probably rejoining Lulu under an alternate account. He was discovered within months, and again, his account was shut down. Deprived of other reliable avenues, or rather the thought that why didn't Chris just start an entirely different project on his own, or take this time to actually improve his craft so that his style would not be recognized by other people, so he wouldn't run the risk of getting himself banned for things that, you know what I'm trying to say is that Chris could have used this time to try again, but again, even that seemed completely over the hill for Chris's ideas. Chris was torpidly sought other ways to sell his own works. He opened a shop on Redbubble, an online shopping company where users can sell custom printed items based on images of the seller's choice. On the 3rd of October 2017, selling pictures of himself pre-Tom Girl and drawings of himself on framed pictures, pillows and miniskirts, among others. Much later, on the 23rd of November 2019, the spiritual successor to Chris's Etsy opened as a new website of the same name, quickfillshopping.com. Here, Chris would offer his handmade trading cards for a My Little Pony themed game at extreme prices. And I don't even know if, this is a site that even still opens, but oh yeah, absolutely. I have worked super hard on this, and actually, let's see if we can actually, get a link to the website itself. Now, it absolutely might be said that the entire website probably is like shut down right now, and a lot of here are just sort of like doxed many of his own customers. Well, why? I'm not surprised, but hang on one second. Let me see if I can get it up. Because usually what you can do is that you can actually link your own shops onto your own like YouTube accounts, which is not exactly unheard of, but we care about your privacy. Okay, well, I'm glad somebody does. Ah, here it is, and apparently we do that. It is still up. Okay, so for what they're worth, this is the links to Chris's. You know what? Okay, so I'm assuming Chris doesn't have a Linktree account, and Linktree is something that actually quite a lot of the people that I work with, and I probably should get one of these myself, but what these basically are is they showcase collections of your work, other websites, like again through Twitter, through YouTube, Instagram, about what people are up to, the developmental processes, the rates of commission. But I suppose let's just go for Etsy shop first. Let's just see if switch to Shopify for free for start selling for free. Let's visit website. So remember, guys, he works super hard on this, even though again the presentation is dreadful, to be honest. I mean, I know again this is mostly just meant to be for links, but you could have told me Chris could have done a little bit more than this. So I'm guessing it's not there. Okay, so let's try Lorger. I don't exactly know what Lorger is. Now, it could be possible these things were taken down. Find places to stay on an Airbnb. Absolutely no way. Thank you. So I guess that means that leaves... what on it? Quickville shop. Related searches. So I'm guessing that literally I'm guessing it ceases to exist now. We might have to look into this a little bit more detail, but again, we care about privacy. That's so you know that it couldn't have involved anything to do with Chris. Commissioning. In December 2015, the singularity happened. On Etsy, Chris offered to create a personalized video message for anyone who paid $50, making Chris possibly a pioneer when it comes to, you know, websites and apps like Cameo. Unfortunately, $50 sounds... I mean, if people are willing to, you know, pay $5, that might be still a little bit way too much, but it's more than reasonable. And Chris would probably receive a larger influx of orders for as little as $5. So, and besides, considering how long these videos would be, you're about to work out that even $5 is probably way too much to ask. Many of his fans took him up on the offer, thinking they could become a part of Christree by simply handing their money over to him. He received 4 sales in the first 3 days. Although these customers opted for their videos to be unlisted, a few people also chose public videos for their birthday shoutouts. After losing his Etsy shop, Chris continued offering video requests through text messages. The videos Chris delivers are categorized by laziness. He has often been late on delivering, missing deadlines for birthday greetings despite having an abundance of free time, and then will say, you know, it wasn't his fault anyway. And I've seen some of them as well, ladies and gentlemen. He doesn't exactly, you know what, take accountability for the fact that he knows fine well he could have done this much sooner. Sloppiness. Chris chooses not to edit his takes or look presentable. He has delivered a video featuring an upskirt shot of his maxi pad. Ew. Explicitly stating that the content is boring in many videos. Chris has mentioned his low opinion of his customers, saying like, whatever, and wow, that's crazy, and just, I feel like it's weird, whatever, while rolling his eyes. That's, again, ladies and gentlemen, you may have heard before, again, a pretty interesting phrase used in business called image is everything. Well, unfortunately, even if Chris had literally purposely dressed up in, like, his blue sweater and his, like, Sunday hat, no, I'm completely under the impression that that would have been way too much for Chris, even if he was going to do all the videos in one go, because Chris... well, to be honest, I think the sincere issue is that Chris just doesn't care. He doesn't care that he has to try. He doesn't care that he has to put effort into anything. And he could lay things on, him feeling bad and depressed. Well, I've got some news for you, ladies and gentlemen. There have been many, many occasions where I felt bad, depressed, and I feel like didn't do anything whatsoever. But you know what? There comes a time in your life where you realize that that's not good enough. And you've got to try. And, well, whether I liked it or not, I still tried. And you know what? Even in occasions where I didn't feel like it was even worth it, I still put my all into it. Something that Chris has never... Well, to say Chris has never done this either is a little bit mean, I suppose. But again, think about what exactly people are doing for you, Chris. Think about the fact that $50 is quite a lot of money in the eyes of some people, and that's not good enough. That's not good enough to motivate Chris to try. I would keel over and absolutely, dress like I was about to get married if somebody was going to pay me 50 quid for a shout out on Cameo or whatever Chris was doing. Filling up paid content time with drivel of off-topic ramblings, despite the fact that his videos are advertised as around a minute in length on average, but can be longer in time length. In spite of these issues, he has a continuing stream of customers. A Kiwi Farms user named Vanilla Cone summed up the mindset a lot with his review of the $50 paid video he ordered from Chris. This is something as well that Chris seems to have completely underestimated, is the fact that, again, his customers have the authority and the power to dictate to other people through reviews about if Chris is worth going to. Something probably that Chris has never considered, or, again, like everything else, he couldn't care less about. Which consisted of him being late, babbling to fill up time, failing to spell the recipient's name correctly, and delivering a video 39 seconds long out of the minimum 1 minute. To be honest, I got what I expected out of the video, and money well spent in my opinion. Well, if that's the way you want to put it, I suppose. I mean, I don't know if he's trying to be sarcastic about this, but, Chris joined Patreon on the 30th of November 2016 as a response to pressure from the financial crisis. He initially set it up to beg for money, claiming that he would produce more Solitude comics if his parents paid off his mortgage and bills. He was met with low support levels, generally below $40 a month. Which makes Chris, there was once a point where the highest I've actually ever made a month from Patreon in like the 5 years I've been used the site is roughly $15 a month. And then through taxes and then through PayPal, I only really get like 10 quid a month from this. But I was glad enough to do it. And I was glad enough to get it because, again, you have to understand people pay you, and you know what? That's not how it is. Which, again, falls into the mindset of the fact that Chris has no real value or understanding of money anyway, apart from when he's in short supply of it. Which is an attitude that changes when you're running a business, and that even though you have money, it's so easy to lose, so you hang on to it as though it was your balls. This suddenly changed around June 2017, picking up momentum from resuming the Solitude comic of his own volition in May. He revamped his Patreon to offer more reasonable support tiers for his fans. He has enjoyed a significant uptick in support due to his continued work on the comics, earning around $500 to $600 per month. Good lord. As his interest in his comic has abated, and new pages more rarely released, Patreon support has shriveled to about a third of its peak, reforming his backer awards by distinguishing different tiers for every dollar level given have not improvised or improved his steady decline in support. And it should also be worth mentioning, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that Chris, I think at one point went nearly a year and a half without actually uploading anything to meet his paid obligations. I don't know what the exact number is, but it was some point just before he got arrested, before Patreon had enough and basically pulled the plug. Miscellaneous affairs. In May 2016, Chris displayed a level of financial ignorance that shatters any hope of him ever becoming competent with money. Days after begging for donations to assist his ailing household, he announced that he would be starting his own business. With a declaration that each employee's salary would be 25% of the profit, which meant that if Chris hired at least 4 people, he would be completely out of pocket. Now, I should also point out is that what I do is that Gumroad recently introduced a feature that you can actually collaborate with people, which means that depending on what you put down and also things that can be discussed privately, you can designate how much a person would earn if you worked on a project together. So that if it was between 2 people, me and somebody else, the profits would be split 50-50. If a third person was involved, it would be 33, it would be a third each. If it was 4 people, everyone would receive a quarter each, and so on, stuff like that. Now, some might argue immediately that I would still be out of pocket, because if I'm producing and financing everything, and I'm only taking away maybe half or even a third of any profits made, but that also comes down to how well these things sell. So, but it also, then again, I'm also into absolutely supporting the people that commission me anyway, so it's in many ways quite good through word of mouth, and it's good to actually boost a certain bona fides. I will become buen chico in the eyes of many people, which is becoming my favorite. I do like the phrase buen chico. Naturally, Chris completely fails to realize that under these conditions, he would have no money at all if he had 4 or more employees. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Days later, he uploaded a video attempting to go into business with Sega to create official Sonichu products. In the video, he demands a 6-figure salary, quite demanding, along with full insurance benefits and maternity leave. I mean, that's vague, but that's, again, sounds incredibly demanding and impossible. Chris does not have a uterus, a womb, ovaries. Again, where's the fetus going to kick off? What's Chris going to do? Just carry it around in a box? Symbolic of Chris's struggle against reality, once again. These incidents seem to indicate Chris's belief that money comes out of nowhere and is unlimited in value. 3 years later, in April 2019, Sonichu Entertainment of America was noted by Google Maps, prompted Chris to laud his company as legitimate in a video, though it would see no further activity. Womp friggin' womp. On the 24th of November 2016, Chris asked his audience to watch a clip of him playing Skylanders by uploading Quick vs. Coas in order to promote the idea of selling his in-game figurines to them using the game Skylanders creation app. He would charge $20 extra for his autograph. He also said, "I am not sharing my creation app Chirp," since this would allow people to order directly from Skylanders and cut Chris's goal of profiting from his self-image completely out of the loop. Though people were absolutely right to probably use this anyway and, again, not give money to Chris. Because this is almost akin to... some of you guys may remember the game Azua's Wrath, which was a game released by Capcom that infamously sold the true ending to the game as a DLC that you had to pay extra for. So if you bought Azua's Wrath, then it means you bought an incomplete game if you didn't buy the DLC. This is why I play games by From Software, because even last year when I actually bought Bloodborne for the very first time, it was only £18 and it came with the Old Hunters DLC. So you basically got the best game From Software has ever made, including the best DLC of any video game ever made, and they sold it cheap. And bear in mind, forget the fact that it was 8 years old by the time I bought it. It's still incredibly... It's still perhaps one of the greatest video games ever played. And I can't undersell enough how much I love Bloodborne, but I can't also overstate that Chris is completely deluded at the fact that he thinks this is going to work and people would get even one sale out of this. On the 12th of January 2017, Chris uploaded Skylanders Imaginators leader Christine W. Chandler Random Stuff Reviewing Stuff as a half-hour advertisement video showing off multiple Skylanders products he had ordered, a $15 card, a $30 t-shirt, and a $50 3D doll, all emblazoned with his avatar image, totaling at least $90. Not cheap. Chris should probably work for Bethesda instead. Chris's largest business failure to date followed soon after. Various Skylanders avatar products and a Sonichu figure were announced as prize raffles for a raffle Chris conceived to push sales for his stamps, started to run from the 27th of March through the 31st of April 2017. The cost of entry was buying one of Bob's stamps or Chris's stamp album on eBay, with a limit of 1 entry per buyer. Initially, Chris announced that the winner would receive a Sonichu figure and a Skylanders figure, and 15 runners-up would each receive a Skylanders card. A week later, he added more prizes to the mix, Skylanders t-shirts. Chris seemed to be banking on the $1,000 album selling, as it was the only scenario in which he could have shown a profit from the raffle. He promised an automatic win of a set of all 3 prizes. His expenditure for the raffle prizes totaled $840. No one bought the album, and less than 15 people participated in the raffle. Although a mass buyer had purchased 18 stamps, he was left with a negative profit of $674.24. In December of 2020, Chris teamed up with Praetor to produce more Sonichu medallions. The medallions are not created by Chris, but he supposedly oversees the design and production of the medallions. The medallions are of noticeably worse quality than those created by Chris, but that hasn't stopped the team from selling over 130 medallions as of the 14th of December 2020. The jointly owned Etsy page can be found here, so let's get to it. The official Quickville Mart. Christine is back, new art produced daily, and Chris, allegedly, they've made nearly over 4,000 sales. So, 100, this is the best seller, $107, and this literally looks like it was made out of wax and not clay, because it even looks like it's almost starting to melt. All the paint is literally not dried, and there are smudge marks around Sonichu's eyebrows, and, well, it looks like something that my 2-year-old cousin would make. And then, of course, there's all the items. Well, there's the Sonichu issue 0, and over 20 people have this in their basket, but just decided literally to leave it at the door. And then, of course, the official medallions are like $34. And bear in mind, the actual this medallion, which was actually made by Chris, more. Then there's the actual certificate of authenticity, the book deals, the rocks. Chris is literally selling rocks to people and charging money for it. Commissions, lost commissions, despite the fact you could just literally, click and then save. And, well, that's it right here. And you've got somebody who looks about as, well, happy as you can get. I don't want to 100% disprove the fact that people think they're getting a good deal out of this. However, I would argue very much so that, well, do you really think it's worth giving money to Chris or the people involved? Because if you don't know at this point about Chris, well, outside of the incest investigations, well, it's probably not worth it either. I wouldn't. Because outside of the fact that it just doesn't seem like something that's entirely profitable, I can't really risk my own image being tarnished by the idea of being associated with Chris. By May 2022, the partnership with Praetor extended to selling monochrome artwork Chris had drawn whilst in jail. Naturally, given the new delusions Chris had begun to machinate shortly after ending up behind bars, these drawings primarily center around his pseudo-religion. Abortive ventures. In November 2015, Chris announced that he would be setting up a shop on Zazzle.com. He mentioned it again half a year later in June 2016. No progress was made, and to this day, Chris has never opened a Zazzle shop. Why he dragged his feet so much is unknown. Zazzle takes care of manufacturing and shipping, and there are no startup costs. All he would have to do is take some Sonichu drawings and upload them. In October 2017, amid being the subject of interviews by Merryweather, Satsumo, and Coppercab, Chris announced that he was open to being a guest on more interviews for payment. Although he didn't specify his going rate, Merryweather mentioned that Chris had asked him for $200. He has since given interviews for free, taking the bend out of his potential scheme, although it seems that he was paid for the Create Unknown interview in October 2020. Yeah, okay. Customers and their reasons for buying. A piece of valuable internet culture. A potential buyer on Chris's comics. While many who follow Chris refuse to give him money and shun those who do, buyers seem to regard Chris memorabilia as pieces of internet culture that might become valuable over time. No, my enormous signed portrait featuring a black and white image of Only Fools and Horses, accompanied by a signature from Sir David Jason, including cartoon caricatures of all the characters. That is actually worth something. I remember I bought it for like £200 nearly 2 years ago, and that is an actual investment of sorts, I guess you could say. But Chris is not like that. A February 2019 video in which a customer unboxed a Sonichu issue comic printed from Lulu attracted over 100,000 views, and many commentators expressed a desire to buy for themselves. Ironically, the resulting bump in Chris's Patreon gave him so many orders to fulfill that he crashed into slumber and simply ignored the backlog of orders. And by the way, you may want to take a look at this, because this is from potential customers. So it begins with, for $20, that's pretty good, a piece of internet history, which was then met with, I don't think about it that way, but yes, it's a good conversation starter. Dude, I'd so give $20 for that. I have a feeling that these will be worth a lot someday. 100 years later, he will be an abnormal legend. I agree, $20 is valuable internet culture, is pretty fair. All that costs $20. I can't exactly imagine if any of them actually have bought anything, but whatever, I suppose. Ad revenue. When he was uploading his Sonichu comic pages to the Wikipedia in 2009, he thought of monetizing his webcomic had never crossed his mind. People had been annoying, nay, harassing him with advertising he didn't approve of, yet when he attempted to replace these offensive ads with ads of his own, he simply put some random advertisements on his webpage without actually signing any sort of advertising contract. The ads didn't make him any money. There are several advertising programs that allow individual people to put ads on their personal pages and make money out of them that way. Some of these programs are even specifically geared toward webcomic artists. Many webcomics have a donation box where readers can donate money to the artist via PayPal or similar services. In 2016, Chris monetized his YouTube channel and added a support button, ostensibly to accept donations for Sonichu projects, even though he didn't want to work on that, and for a whole year, YouTube simply began another place from which he could earn money. It took a while for Chris to try drawing on camera in live drawing streams, and even then, he hasn't demonstrated it too often and has done an extremely poor job of it. Much like everything else in his life, but never mind. He simply sits in front of his PlayStation 4 camera, which is hard-coded to only record it in flip mirror mode, and is positioned so that viewers see an upside-down video at a dizzying angle. We'll discuss more about this when it comes to Chris's approaches towards, cinematography. Scheduling slip. Most webcomics have a set schedule. Some update weekly, some many times a week, some daily. Some webcomics update whenever the hell the artists get inspired enough to draw a comic. And probably reserve a whole form for people who whine about lack of updates. Most webcomic artists that update the comic 3 times a week consider that schedule very demanding. and webcomics that update daily usually generate revenue of some description. Ads, donations, print versions, merchandise, what have you, allowing the artists to treat their comics like a full-day job. These are called self-sufficient webcomics, such as Penny Arcade, XKCD, questionable content. Although Chris has thoroughly embraced the point of view that the comic shouldn't have a set schedule and inspiration doesn't have a deadline, while also promising us that the comic would be updated daily, on the 14th of November 2009, Chris promised that the comic would be updated daily, and he managed to fulfill this promise for a while. By the end of Sonichu issue 10, Chris was already placing author substitutes in the story, telling people to quit whining about the lack of updates. Which is going to drive... you couldn't drive away more customers if you were literally willing to open fire on them. This is obviously not a question of punctuality, but hypocrisy. Chris would avoid a lot of drama if he just admitted that there's no set schedule whatsoever after all. If one does consider this a question of punctuality, it doesn't look too good. Chris also tends to update in spurts in an attempt to make up for missed days. This can range anywhere from 3 to 20 pages at a time. Most professional web cartoonists have a buffer of guest comics so that they can avoid this sort of thing, but the thought of doing so has apparently never entered Chris's autistic mind. The same mindset also pervades every other aspect of his business, namely that Chris will procrastinate on shipping orders. A key example is how he almost fucked up the Sonic Totem sale. He received $1,500 for it, immediately wasted much of his profit on bling, and failed to ship it to the buyer on time, saying he had run out of money to pay for mailing it, and only got around to having his mother scrounge up enough cash to do so after the buyer filed a PayPal dispute. He almost lost his Etsy shop as a direct result of his poor work ethic. Like I mentioned before, ladies and gentlemen, proud and lazy people do not make good businessmen. Pipe dreams. When do you want Nintendo and Sega to talk to me to evolve Sonichu and Rosechu more realistically? Now! Chris demanding that multinational corporation take orders from a nobody. Chris has had numerous aspirations to work in creative industries. So far, he has expressed his desire to make several official Sonichu video games and work on a real Sonichu comic. For a real comic publisher, however, the reasons best known to himself, he elects not to find out how these industries actually work, something that, again, people should do before they even get into it. Which is quite strange. One would assume that a person seeking a career in the industries would at least take some effort to find out how the said industries worked. Official publication. In the Sonichu comics and Chris's resume, it's revealed that Chris is under the impression that his art isn't just good, but professional quality, and that he aspires to get into the comics and video games business. The resume reveals his widely varied skills for both pens and crayons, and his desire to work as an artist for a professional comic company such as Archie Comics or Marvel, creating his Sonichu comics. There is no word on whether or not he actually submitted anything to these companies or if they ever replied. I'd say probably both, to be honest. Unfortunately for Chris, the publishing industry doesn't work this way, especially not in the case of original creations. In the case of original work, the publishers would expect complete works to be submitted to them, usually through an agent or perhaps an editor. An agent's job is to separate the wheat from the chaff and find the correct publisher for the work, taking a small percentage of the eventual profit for their reward. If the publishers take unsolicited submissions, they have to sift through a gigantic backlog, often called slush pile, of submissions of highly varying quality, most of which end up rejected multiple times before there will be a publisher with the right market in mind and the right publication schedule to allow the publication deal to go forward. The whole process can take years in case of a single work. Anyone who has ever read the Bokumon series, not Bokugon, Bokumon was a manga series that I believe was created by the same team that gave us Death Note. about the very unrewarding ramifications of the actual manga industry. And it's the sort of thing that, to be honest, is a sad reflection of the creative process, not just in terms of having an idea, but also actually publishing it to Shonen Jump or Shonen Weekly to make sure that, you know, there are people that are going to see their work and if it would be commissioned for a full long series. If comic book publishers have salaried artists, and again, bear in mind, again, the thing about publishing is that that's why quite a lot of manga artists and writers, they usually start off with a small, very short series, and then they would have that sort of experience to move on to something more substantial. I mean, take Akashihira Ikeda, for example. Some of you may remember Mr. Ikeda as the artist and writer behind the Rosario Vampire series, a series that ended, the actual manga itself ended 10 years ago this year. You may remember that he actually worked on, I think, 2 other independent projects before the idea for Rosario Vampire was not only pushed in the direction of Shonen Jump in at least 2002, and then was actually released for sale in 2004. 20 years ago. The more you know, ladies and gentlemen. If comic book publishers have salaried artists, they usually need to have a portfolio of previous work. Like I said, usually work that has already been published commercially, there you go, or if the comic house is particularly lenient and most big names aren't. Which is, again, probably wouldn't be in the case for Shonen Jump, but that's just from what I understand. There has to be evidence of a successfully self-published high-quality comic, and even in this case, these artists usually only work on characters and plot lines that come from inside the house. It can take time before the artist is in any position to present their own ideas for comics, or use their own original characters. Even if he were able to stick in a company for a long time, he'd still need to improve his communication skills a lot. If the Solitude Chronicles PowerPoint and various phone conversations are of any indication, he's unable to persuade his superiors that his ideas are worth pursuing or working on. The best case of example I can present, ladies and gentlemen, is that when I started writing my short stories, I only wanted to write my short stories because I had ideas for much grander projects in the future. But the problem is that I needed to... It's basically getting your foot in the door. And what I had to do was present a style or present the fact that I was capable of writing something that was not only sort of a little bit more in my field, but something that actually could turn quite a few heads. And some of you may have seen videos where I literally can write a poem in less than 3 minutes, completely from scratch, or I can write an entire story in less than 30 seconds, consisting of a single letter. And in case, and some of you may think this is bragging or showing off, but then again, artists or even those who want to be taken seriously, at some point they have to demonstrate why their skills are superior to that of other people. It is a little bit of a competition in place, ladies and gentlemen, but it's a competition where you are almost competing against yourself. You are sometimes your own worst enemy in cases like these, but then again, in the case of Chris, he virtually has no equal whatsoever. He is basically always has been his own worst enemy, and, well, you don't really need me to tell you guys this, but again, for someone who has somewhat of an experience or somewhat knows about these sorts of things, and then in my opinion, even though I'm in the middle of just trying to run a business myself, I still feel like, again, my experience is somewhat only curtailed to what I had before, which only equates to roughly about 2 years of experience. Whether you want to say 2 years is enough, or whether or not that's more than enough, just as long as you're willing to put in the time and trouble and effort, well, that's entirely down to you. But in Chris's case, this is almost Chris the idea of thinking that he can cook and deciding that he's going to open a restaurant. bear in mind, I mentioned that, like, the idea that Chris thought he could just skip out, culinary school and work experience by working in somebody else's restaurant. This is Chris thinking he could just decide to open a restaurant even though he's never worked in one or actually trained as one. That's kind of summarizing a little bit about where we are at right now. In short, Chris is deluded if he thinks that any company will just pick him up and tell him to work on Sonichu Comics. Even if Chris does get it, there's also the problem with scheduling. Most comics are worked on far in advance, thus allowing for any changes concerning a book, such as plot problems, character availability changes, or even cancellations. Even so, many of them maintain a certain schedule, either monthly or bi-monthly, sometimes quarterly. Very rarely do comics go bi-weekly, once every 2 weeks. Though weekly series have been more common through infrequent DC Comics, for example, experimented with the weekly format in the 80s with Action Comics Weekly, an anthology which bombed and put the title on hiatus for a few months, returning to its normal Action Comics title and monthly format 20 years later. DC has churned out a number of weekly sales, including the New 52, Countdown, Trinity, and more recently, the New 52, Future's End. And for reasons that... And listen, I've been watching the YouTuber Linkara for many, many years now. 10 years, I think I've been watching him. Is that I watched his entire series on the Countdown weeklies, as well as a large part about the absolute failure that it was, the New 52, before they decided to format the idea again and go forwards. But then again, a lot of this could even come down to the fact that Chris has no real desire or interest in comic books anyway. I mean, what was exactly stopping Chris from actually deciding to purchase an issue of Superman American Alien, for example? Or what was stopping Chris from buying a graphic novel of basically a collector's edition of something like Batgirl of Burnside, or going through, or just buying other things that he thinks that might be of some way influential, like, certain Sonic the Hedgehog comics or Archie comics. You know what? Things that actually would give him somewhat of an experience about how not only to write, but also how to take his stories in new directions and lights. But again, like I said before, Chris might simply have no interest, availability, and wouldn't care anyway. Chris, however, has no schedule. His schedule consists of whenever he has the inspiration to work. Not good enough. That doesn't cut it. Even if Chris went with that alone, he would have a release schedule that would rival Rob Liefeld and Valve, and where Liefeld, for the most part, could get away with it because he owned his company at one point, despite the fact that, even though he does, Rob Liefeld is no artist. And people have gotten him to actually do the work, with mixed results. If Chris pulled this kind of stunt, he'd be out on the street so fast his head would spin. Chris's understanding of copyright is a chapter in itself. Publishers want primarily original works, because securing the necessary rights to publish derivative works is often difficult or impossible. Chris has even resisted attempts to educate him in this regard. And again, resisting attempts by people who know far better than him is, again, a recipe for disaster. I need to shut my window. There's somebody sawing, even though it's pouring outside. Right, there we go. That's that sorted. On the 14th of August 2017, Chris uploaded a video where he updated the true and loyal fanbase on his progress on Sonichu issue 13, which he has renumbered as Sonichu 12-9. He states that he decided to change the focus of the comic. Instead of being a crossover between the Sonichu gang and the Planet Dolan crew, it would instead be a fanfiction devoted to his pony avatar Nightstar. Throughout the video, he mentions how he not only wants the comic to be a piece of fanfiction, but now he also wants it to be canon to My Little Pony, where he would voice Nightstar herself. Of course, Chris doesn't seem to realize that the creators of the show can't simply pick up his idea because, as stated earlier, it may lead to an accusation of idea theft. Yet another reason why, which is probably on borderline even worse than people who steal other people's art, something Chris is guilty of as well, but we'll come to that later. Yet another reason why the publishing industry wouldn't accept Sonichu in its current state is because of how sloppily written and egocentric it is in tone. If a publisher somehow, and somehow is a big if, did agree to make Sonichu comics, they would more likely task other writers, not to mention artists, with actual talents to shape up the premise into something at least passable. Predictably though, or enough, Chris would balk at lacking control over his life's work, and of course, anyone doing better than him. Games and merchandise. Chris could approach Sega and Nintendo and ask them to make Sonichu games, comics, and merchandise. This plan would be doomed to failure almost from the very beginning, because no media companies want unsolicited ideas from the public. There are several reasons for this. First, it takes effort to sift through ideas piles, and they can't give an equal amount of thought on the countless ideas fans send them. While game companies may listen to their fans, they usually just want them to know if the time is right for something they've been planning to do. For example, no doubt a big part of the reason why the newer Fire Emblem games got worldwide release was that the fans of Marth and Roy from Super Smash Bros. Melees were wondering aloud, why the hell isn't Nintendo just releasing these games outside of Japan? Then, of course, another example is the developers of World of Warcraft saying that why don't they just introduce a classic server? And then, of course, there's the disaster of, Diablo Immortal. Do you guys just not have phones? Because the backlash was immediate. They most certainly don't have the capability of starting a whole new game project just because somebody asks for it. If the game companies respond by saying Chris had, as he himself so eloquently put, rocks in his head, then you probably don't get a slice of their precious time for making a second impression. Simply put, Chris thinks that even when the companies aren't busy with other projects, they still have time to think of his grandiose ideas and those things only. Second, there is an age-old problem in a litigious society. A fan writes to the company and says, I have this cool idea. The company says, thanks but no thanks. One of the in-house writers comes up with exactly the same idea by accident, and boom, you have a fan who's suing you for identity theft. Or idea theft, I should say. And even if that lawsuit will usually go nowhere, it wastes perfectly usable time, energy, and most of all the money that could be used for more fruitful ventures. A famous example is British novelist Terry Pratchett, who used to post in his Uniset fan group until one of his fans was convinced Terry had stolen his ideas. Therefore, the most media houses will just say that they will not take ideas from the public. The game industry is not an exception. This fact has been pointed out to Chris numerous times, and at least twice by real Nintendo representatives, as evidenced by the letters he has read in the captain's logs. Unfortunately, Chris misinterpreted all this. I don't really know how you can do this, but there you are. Another thing that Chris disregards is the fact that writing games takes a lot of effort. In Thomas Edison's words, getting things done is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Many good ideas don't get implemented. No one is going to invest energy in developing an idea alone if they don't know if the idea can be implemented. Game companies may be willing to negotiate a deal to use their properties, such as characters in games developed by third parties, but those proposals are usually backed up by real companies. Actual creative teams of developers, and serious complete plans for games, if not outright working prototypes already. Even if the properties are tacked on by a prototype later on, the prototypes are usually fully developed so that they can be used without those properties if the plans fall through. For example, Star Fox Adventures began as a game that was completely unrelated to the Star Fox universe, but Nintendo felt the game was better with SF characters. Or sometimes a company will literally just say, that doesn't really fit in with what we'll do, we'll just create a new identity out of that, because many remember that Devil May Cry was basically born through this philosophy, because it was meant to be originally a Resident Evil game, but its gameplay was far too action-oriented than the slightly stiller versions of the Resident Evil games, post Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and then Devil May Cry was born and was sort of released around about the same time Code Veronica X was released. I know it was like the year 2000 it was released, so it's probably around about the same time. Surprisingly, in the homemade Nintendo Power magazine, then high schooler age Chris offered a slightly better description of how the 3 fictional Sonic game releases he hoped would play out than his proposals for Sonichu games later on, and even then, they're highly basic and unoriginal ideas. For example, Super Mario 64 with Sonic the Hedgehog as its playable character, and Super Mario All-Stars with the 4 classic Sonic games originally for the Sega Genesis. Theoretically, it would be possible, though extraordinarily unlikely, for Sega and Nintendo to cooperate enough to make a game featuring a Sonic-Pikachu hybrid named Sonichu. The most they've ever come to would be something close to the Mario and Sonic Olympic Games series. And even then, there was a reason why they haven't made anything post the 2014 Sochi Winter Games in Russia. They would not, however, need any input from Chris whatsoever, or even his permission to combine characters that they own. Think about it. Of course, the idea of releasing it cross-platform for Sony consoles remains yet another absurd and feathered dream on the part of Chris. Actually, you know what? Speaking of, Mario and Sonic in the Olympic Games, did any of you guys ever play those games? I played the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics, and I played the London 2012 Summer Games. I loved those games. I didn't play the Beijing Olympic, the original one, and I didn't play the one for Sochi either, but trust me, once you played basically the 2 best in the series, the Vancouver and the London games, what more do you need, eh? In the Sonichu Chronicles, he gives Shigeru Miyamoto permission, oh that's nice of him, to use the cover of his hand-drawn Nintendo Power magazine as the inevitable cover for when his game is created, even though it's several years old, and in fact even worse than Chris's current skeleton art. To the surprise of absolutely no one, Chris has held on to dreams of Sonichu getting turned into a video game character well into November of 2023, when he posted a request to personally work with Nintendo, offering them his OCs to be integrated into Pokemon canon. Equally unsurprisingly, is that Chris seems to be unaware, willfully or otherwise, that Nintendo has nothing to gain by granting fans ludicrous desires for all the reasons mentioned here, especially not to someone who has just been released from jail, where he had been kept for a felony that shook the internet to its very core. In general, an issue Chris would face in the industries he aspired to contribute towards is that mainstream publishers will not allow any pornographic material which Chris had nonchalantly drawn into his supposedly kid-friendly comics. Thus, Chris would be forced to comply with a set of rules to make his magnum opus acceptable for the masses. And we all know how that would turn out. By a similar token, both Nintendo and Sega would probably not allow the extremely violent and sexual imagery the comic didn't shy away from, especially since he considers Sonichu appropriate for kids, although he did not imagine his adult chronicles to be rated M for honest content. And that's if they didn't reject it outright because of said imagery. Not to mention, Chris had drawn smut of his magnum opus in the past, which could make a bad first impression on any reputable company approached to work with him. Not to mention that Chris, being the egotist we know and love, would have to essentially hand over the rights to Sonichu or to whichever company agrees to his own IP, meaning he would have little to no say if how it plays out according to his whims. If Chris actually were in a position of creative control, consider this. During the majority of time the Wikipedia was online, Chris acted as if he had free rein to dictate a site of others made and hosted for him, so letting him be head honcho for a comic or game production would be a colossal mistake. Needless to say, the stress of working under him, which would lead to some unfortunate writers and developers to quit and/or the higher-ups to eventually fire him. Some other people as well would say that they would straight up refuse to work anything associated with Chris and would have served orders to quit years ago. The future of Chris and his business attempts. After the life-changing incest scandal in the midsummer of 2021, Prater successfully continued business with Chris, selling drawings as he had made during incarceration, and since his release from jail, a further run of medallions and other assorted junk, as well as setting up live streams, some of which consisted of Weens donating nearly as much as $700 per live stream, and Chris would actually just make money from this, as well as possible ad revenue for doing absolutely nothing special whatsoever and basically playing hopscotch with the law ever since his creation of Sonic 2 nearly 25 years ago. And so on, and so on, and so on. Now, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen, I could literally have multiplied this entire article by literally the next 10 hours by sitting here going through the litigations, comparing and contrasting both with myself, with actual more established, successful artists and writers. But I think it's fair to say, ladies and gentlemen, that no matter what we ever tried to pursue, or the fact that it was also probably maybe in the best interest of Chris if he actually did pursue a business degree instead of his CAD degree, well, I think it's also fair to say that any attempts Chris would walk in and literally he would be shown the way out. In fact, they wouldn't even do that. They would just create a revolving door that only has one exit, which is a bit unfortunate, but unfortunately, like I said, well, Chris has nobody except himself to blame for this because, as I've mentioned many, many times before, you are 100% responsible for the choices you make, and when you want to assert yourself as the head of a business, then you have to be prepared. And Chris is not prepared. He's not prepared to take responsibility, accountability, put in the work, put in the effort to make sure his image is impeccable, make sure that anything he does, past, present, and or future, is enough to make sure that he is successful or to protect his image so that people will absolutely know that he is the person to trust and therefore worth their time. So in that regards, ladies and gentlemen, Chris is completely and utterly screwed. And with all that being said and done, I hope you guys have learned something from this, and I actually enjoyed just talking about business a lot more than I thought I ever would before, only because maybe as time's gone on, I've become a little bit more, I fitted a little bit more into the role more than I thought I would, and I cannot wait to talk with you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.